Long before temples, priests, or written prayers, someone knelt beside a dead child and placed an object in the grave. Was it grief, memory, or the first trace of belief? These 10 burials take us back more than 100,000 years to the uncertain boundary between burial and belief. Number 10 begins beneath one of the world's earliest towns. Number 10. The dead beneath Çatalhöyük. In central Anatolia, thousands of people once entered their homes through openings in the roof. They cooked, slept, painted walls, and raised children inside tightly packed mud brick buildings. And beneath the platforms where they carried out daily life, they buried their dead. Çatalhöyük was occupied between roughly 7,100 and 5,950 BC. Archaeologists have recovered the remains of hundreds of people from its buildings. Some were placed in primary burials soon after death. Others were disturbed when later graves were opened. Certain bones were removed, circulated, and eventually deposited again. This was not a settlement with a separate cemetery beyond its walls. The dead remained inside the architecture of the living. At first, that arrangement seems to offer an obvious explanation. Perhaps each family kept its ancestors beneath the house. But the evidence refuses to remain that simple. Genetic studies do not show that everyone beneath a building belonged to one close biological family. Nor did every resident receive the same treatment. Pigments provide another clue. Red ochre was the most common, but researchers have also identified cinnabar and, in a small number of cases, blue or green minerals. Some pigments were applied directly to the body. Others were placed in the grave. Statistical analysis has even found a relationship between the number of burials in certain buildings and the number of painted architectural layers inside them. Most burials did not contain pigment. That absence is important. Color was selected rather than applied automatically, and the choice was not explained by age or biological sex alone. Cinnabar appeared mainly on the skulls of certain individuals. Blue and green minerals were rarer still and came from sources beyond the immediate settlement. The pattern suggests decisions made within a shared tradition, not one fixed rule imposed on every death. The implication is not that every painted wall was a shrine. It is that burial, color, architecture, and social memory were connected. A house could preserve more than shelter. It could preserve relationships. Yet, archaeology cannot tell us whether the people of Çatalhöyük believed the dead watched over the household. Burial beneath a floor might express ancestry, community membership, claims to place, or several ideas at once. The evidence shows repeated ritual action. It does not reveal the words spoken above the grave. By the time Çatalhöyük flourished, however, the relationship between buildings and the dead was already highly developed. To approach its beginnings, we have to leave the first large settlements behind. More than 3,000 years earlier, inside a small cave in the southern Levant, a community constructed an unusual grave. What they left there suggests that death had already become an event capable of bringing many people together. Number 9. The so-called shaman of Hilazon Taktit. The grave was cut into the floor of Hilazon Taktit Cave around 12,000 years ago. It held an older woman whose body had been placed in a carefully prepared stone structure. But it was what surrounded her that made the burial difficult to explain. The builders did not simply dig a pit. They shaped an oval cavity, lined parts of it, added layers of sediment and stone, placed objects in stages, positioned the body, and finally closed the grave beneath a heavy capstone. The sequence required planning, shared labor, and knowledge of how a body would change after death. Around the woman were approximately 50 complete tortoise shells. The grave also contained selected body parts from animals including wild boar, eagle, wild cattle, and leopard. These were not the remains of an ordinary meal that happened to fall into the pit. Their arrangement formed part of the burial. Nearby animal bones added a second piece of evidence. Cut marks, breakage, and the number of tortoises consumed indicate that a large meal accompanied the funerary event. People had gathered, prepared food, eaten, and then incorporated part of that activity into the grave. More recently, researchers constructed an experimental grave based on the archaeological sequence at Hilazon Taktit. Digging, lining, filling, placing a body, and closing the feature required hours of coordinated work. When the experimental grave was reopened 2 years later, decomposition had shifted stones and altered the shape of the pit. The results showed why Natufian builders may have invested in stone architecture. It helped protect the dead from scavengers and collapse. The experiment cannot reveal their beliefs, but it demonstrates that the grave embodied practical knowledge acquired through repeated encounters with death. This was one of the earliest strong examples of a funeral feast. Death was no longer only a problem of what to do with a body. It had become a moment when the group assembled and acted together. The woman's unusual treatment led researchers to describe her as a shaman. Her age, physical condition, animal associations, and exceptional grave could fit the life of a ritual specialist. But that title remains an interpretation. No object identifies her role, and no surviving account tells us how her community understood her. What the evidence does establish is distinction. She was not buried like everyone else. People selected animal parts, prepared the grave in stages, and consumed considerable resources during the ceremony. Her social identity continued to shape events after her death. The feast also tells us something about the living. Constructing the grave and processing so many animals required coordination. Ritual did not merely express the community. It helped create the community by giving people a reason to gather, remember, and perform a shared sequence of actions. But communal ceremony is only one form of attachment to the dead. An older burial from Ice Age Europe preserves something more intimate. It records a loss, a delay, and a decision to open a grave again. Number 8. The Krems-Wackerberg twins. Around 31,000 years ago, two newborn boys were placed side by side in a small grave in what is now Austria. Their bodies were covered with red ochre and protected beneath the shoulder blade of a mammoth. For years, archaeologists suspected that the children were twins. Ancient DNA eventually confirmed something much more specific. They were genetically identical. The grave, however, contained an apparent contradiction. Although the boys shared the same genome, their positions were uneven, and their ornaments were different. One child lay more centrally. The other appeared to have been fitted against the edge of a space that had not originally been prepared for him. Researchers turned to their teeth. Using microscopic examination, computed tomography, isotope measurements, and the distribution of barium associated with breastfeeding, they reconstructed the brief lives of the children. One died at or near birth. His brother survived for approximately 6 or 7 weeks. That changed the meaning of the grave. The boys had not been buried together on the same day. After the second child died, someone returned, lifted the mammoth bone covering, and reopened the burial while the first body was still decomposing. The original grave had not been packed solid with earth. The mammoth shoulder blade acted like a removable lid over a small open space. That design protected the first infant and made later access possible. When the grave was reopened, the earlier skeleton was still articulated and was not carelessly displaced. The sequence suggests that those returning understood both the structure they had built and the condition in which they would find the body. The details became more personal. One infant had 53 mammoth ivory beads arranged near his pelvis, probably once threaded together. The beads showed little or no wear, suggesting they may have been made for the burial. The other infant received perforated shells and a fox tooth, likely worn as a necklace. A third infant was buried only a short distance away. DNA showed that he was a more distant male relative. He, too, was covered with ochre and accompanied by an ivory object. None of this proves that the community expected the children to use those ornaments after death. The objects may have identified individuals, families, or relationships among the living, but the grave establishes something that is just as important. Memory lasted long enough to organize action. The first burial was not sealed and forgotten. Its location was preserved. Its covering could be removed. When the surviving twin died, the community knew exactly where to return and how to place him beside his brother. Here, belief cannot be separated from grief simply by looking at the bones. The archaeological evidence records care, repetition, and personalized treatment. Whether those actions were meant to reunite the twins in another world is unknowable. What survives is the decision that their relationship should remain visible in death. Yet the Krem's grave was excavated with modern methods. Not every famous Ice Age burial was so fortunate. The next discovery was removed from the ground more than 2 centuries ago, and the first story told about it was wrong in almost every important respect. Number 7. The Red Lady of Paviland. In 1823, William Buckland entered a sea cave on the coast of Wales and uncovered human bones stained a deep red. Nearby were ornaments, shells, and rods made from ivory. Buckland concluded that he had found a woman from the Roman period, perhaps a fortune-teller or ceremonial figure. The Red Lady was neither Roman nor female. Later study identified the individual as a young man. Improved radiocarbon methods eventually placed him close to 33,000 years ago, making the burial one of the earliest known ceremonial interments in Western Europe. The red color came from ochre. The pigment had not merely drifted into the cave. It covered the bones and formed part of the treatment of the body. Ivory rods and personal ornaments found in the vicinity suggested a carefully arranged burial, carried out in a glacial landscape, very different from modern Wales. But Paviland also demonstrates how archaeological certainty can disappear. Buckland worked before stratigraphic excavation, radiocarbon dating, or modern recording. Objects were removed without the spatial measurements researchers would demand today. Some associations are strong, others can no longer be tested. His interpretation was also constrained by the history available to him. Human life in Britain was not yet accepted as extending deep into the Ice Age. A burial beside extinct fauna therefore had to be forced into a younger period. Buckland documented the cave with care by the standards of 1823, but the conceptual world around the discovery made its true age almost unthinkable. The landscape adds another reversal. Today, the cave faces the sea. When the burial was created, sea level was lower and the coast lay farther away. The young man was not hidden at the edge of the modern shoreline. He was carried through a cold, open landscape to a cave that may have served as a prominent place of memory. Even the date changed repeatedly. Early measurements produced younger ages because ancient bone collagen had absorbed newer carbon. More rigorous purification pushed the burial farther back in time. The changing interpretation matters. Every generation saw the same red bones, but each placed them inside a different story. Roman ritual became Ice Age burial. A presumed woman became a man. A curiosity became evidence that early modern humans in Northern Europe used color and ornament to transform the dead. What red meant remains unresolved. Across many prehistoric societies, ochre could have evoked blood, life, identity, transformation, or simply an established funerary convention. Archaeology can detect the mineral and reconstruct its application. It cannot recover the concept attached to its color. Paviland shows that a single body could receive special treatment, but the next graves required a level of labor that went far beyond coating bones with pigment. Thousands of objects were made, drilled, arranged, and buried with people who were not even old enough to have earned status through a lifetime of achievement. Number 6. The children of Sungir. Near the Russian city of Vladimir, archaeologists found an adult man stretched out in a grave and covered with red ochre. His clothing had once carried thousands of mammoth ivory beads. Nearby, another burial held 2 children placed head to head. The double grave transformed Sungir into one of the most discussed Paleolithic burial sites in the world. The adult burial had already shown unusual investment. The man known as Sungir I wore rows of ivory beads, pierced fox teeth, bracelets, and pendants. Ochre surrounded the body. Yet the children received an even denser concentration of objects, and many pieces were made in sizes specific to them. The differences indicate that grave wealth was not simply a standard costume given to every person. The children lay in a long, narrow pit. Around them were thousands of carefully standardized ivory beads, pierced fox teeth, pendants, bracelets, carved objects, and long weapons fashioned from mammoth tusk. One ivory spear extended for more than 2 meters. Producing it required softening or working a curved tusk into a straight, functional form. The beads demanded a different kind of investment. Each one had to be shaped, polished, and drilled. Their positions around the skeletons indicate that many had been sewn onto clothing. Even conservative estimates imply hundreds or thousands of hours of specialized work across the Sungir burials. That labor began long before the funeral. Mammoth ivory had to be acquired, divided, and worked with consistent techniques. Fox teeth came from numerous animals. Clothing had to be made and decorated. Some objects may have circulated during life, while others appear unusually fresh. The burial assembled materials from hunting, craft production, and social exchange into one final display. Why invest so much in children? One explanation is inherited status. If the community recognized family rank, children could receive symbols they had not personally earned. Another possibility is that their ages, physical characteristics, or shared deaths gave them a special ritual identity. The grave may also represent an exceptional event rather than an everyday social hierarchy. One juvenile had unusual curvature in the thigh bones. Researchers have debated whether physical difference influenced the exceptional treatment, but the condition alone cannot explain the grave. The other child received comparable investment. Whatever the selection rule was, it extended beyond simple achievement, age, or bodily ability. Ancient DNA complicated the picture. The individuals studied at Sungir were not close biological relatives. Their genomes also showed less recent inbreeding than might be expected in a tiny, isolated band. That suggests these hunter-gatherers belonged to wider social networks through which people moved, met partners, and maintained connections beyond one camp. The grave goods may therefore have communicated identity to an audience larger than a single household. Beads and ornaments could display group affiliation, age, role, or relationships spanning several communities. Burial converted those social signals into a permanent arrangement. There is no solid evidence that the children were sacrificed. Rich graves often encourage dramatic explanations, but a lavish burial only proves that the survivors devoted extraordinary resources to the dead. It does not reveal how death occurred. Sungir forces a larger reconsideration. Mobile Ice Age communities were once imagined as materially simple and socially uniform. Yet these graves required planning, skilled production, access to mammoth ivory, and cooperation across a wide network. Their funerary behavior was capable of expressing differences among people with remarkable precision. Still, a concentration of elaborate burials in Europe can create a distorted impression. Symbolic treatment of the dead was not confined to the mammoth steppe. Around the same period, on the opposite side of the world, two burials preserved entirely different ways of confronting death. Number 5. The burials of Lake Mungo. 40,000 years ago, the Willandra Lakes region of southeastern Australia contained water, fish, animals, and communities whose history remains connected to Aboriginal people today. Along the shore of Lake Mungo, two individuals received very different funerary treatments. One is often known as Mungo Lady. Her bones had been burned, gathered, and buried. The treatment is among the earliest known examples of cremation. The other, known as Mungo Man, was placed in a grave on his back. Red ochre had been scattered over his body, even though the nearest known sources of suitable pigment lay far from the burial place. Transporting ochre into the Willandra landscape transformed an ordinary mineral into evidence of choice. Someone obtained it elsewhere, carried it across country, preserved it, and used it when a death occurred. The pigment connected the grave to places beyond the lakeshore. At first, the two individuals appeared to belong to different periods. Radiocarbon dates, thermoluminescence measurements, and direct tests on the bones produced conflicting results. One proposed age placed Mungo man more than 60,000 years in the past. Then researchers dated the surrounding landscape itself. A series of optical measurements examined when grains of sediment had last been exposed to sunlight. The resulting chronology placed both burials at approximately 40,000 years ago, with an uncertainty of about 2,000 years. That meant two distinct mortuary traditions existed in the same region at roughly the same time. One body was transformed by fire. The other was preserved, positioned, and marked with pigment. The different treatments also undermine the search for one universal first funeral. Even within a connected cultural landscape, age, identity, circumstance, or community tradition could produce different responses. Archaeologists are not observing a single rule spreading mechanically across the world. They are seeing people choose among several meaningful actions. The contrast warns against treating prehistoric belief as a single ladder from simple to complex. Communities could make different choices without one being more advanced than another. Cremation, ochre burial, exposure, and other practices may all express social identity, circumstance, or beliefs that leave different archaeological traces. Lake Mungo also changes how this story must be told. These are not merely scientific specimens. They are ancestors connected to the Pakanchi, Mutti Mutti, and Giampa peoples. The remains became the subject of long campaigns for repatriation. Mungo Lady was returned to her people, and Mungo Man was returned to country decades after his removal. That modern history exposes a difficult continuity. Burial is an action through which a community claims responsibility for the dead. Excavation can disturb that relationship, even when conducted in the name of knowledge. Understanding the past, therefore, requires both scientific evidence and respect for the people whose ancestors are being studied. For that reason, the Lake Mungo story cannot end with measurements alone. The scientific importance of the burials and their continuing cultural importance are not competing facts. Both arise because these individuals remained connected to a place and to people long after death. By 40,000 years ago, funerary behaviors stretched from Europe to Sahul and took multiple forms. That distribution raises a possibility. Perhaps the capacity for ritual burial traveled with modern humans as they dispersed across the world. But an older cave in the Zagros Mountains challenges even that explanation. The bodies placed there did not belong to Homo sapiens. Number 4. The Neanderthals of Shanidar. Shanidar Cave opens high above a valley in what is now Iraqi Kurdistan. During excavations in the 1950s and 1960s, Ralph Selecki's team recovered the remains of several Neanderthals. Some had survived serious injuries. Others lay close together in a part of the cave that seemed to have received the dead more than once. Shanidar I had lost much of one arm, suffered damage to an eye, and lived with other serious impairments. He nevertheless survived for years. That does not prove a formal system of care, but it makes complete isolation unlikely. Long before researchers debated the graves, the Shanidar bodies were already showing that Neanderthal survival depended on social relationships. One individual, Shanidar IV, became famous for something that could not be seen in the bones. Soil samples collected around the skeleton contained clumps of pollen from several flowering plants. The discovery inspired a powerful interpretation. Neanderthals had gathered flowers and laid them beside the dead. The flower burial helped change the public image of Neanderthals. Instead of brutal creatures incapable of emotion, they appeared to mourn, remember, and perhaps perform ceremonies resembling our own. There was only one problem. The flowers might never have been there. Scientists questioned whether pollen could have entered the deposit through wind, animals, contamination, or insects. Recent reassessment produced a particularly convincing alternative. Some clumps contained pollen from different plant species mixed together in a pattern consistent with nesting solitary bees. The plants also did not all flower during the same season, making a single freshly gathered bouquet unlikely. This does not prove that Neanderthals placed no vegetation near the body. Branches, mats, or plants could have been used without leaving a clear signature. It means the romantic image of a carefully arranged bed of colorful flowers is not supported by the available pollen evidence. For decades, that debate overshadowed the more important discovery beneath it. Shanidar IV was not an isolated collection of bones. The individual belonged to a tight cluster of relatively complete Neanderthal remains placed in the same topographic feature. When archaeologists returned to the cave in the 21st century, they found another articulated individual, called Shanidar Z, immediately beside the earlier discoveries. The body had been placed in a natural channel that appears to have been deliberately deepened. Its position was compact and carefully arranged. Sediment and anatomical evidence made random collapse from a higher layer difficult to sustain. The cave had received another body in almost the same location. This changes the question. Flowers would suggest a particular gesture. Repeated placement suggests memory of place. Members of a Neanderthal group may have recognized this part of the cave as a location associated with the dead. They may have returned to it across years or generations. That is not a modern cemetery, and it does not prove belief in an afterlife. But it implies that the dead influenced how the living understood and reused their landscape. Alternative explanations remain. Cave sediments shift. Rockfall killed or covered some Shanidar individuals, and not every skeleton at the site represents deliberate burial. Archaeologists must separate natural deaths from intentional placement one body at a time. This distinction explains why the number of Neanderthal burials changes from one publication to another. A complete skeleton may survive because it was rapidly covered by sediment, not because anyone dug a grave. Conversely, a deliberate placement may leave no visible pit if the body was set into an existing hollow. At Shanidar, context is more informative than completeness alone. Even so, Shanidar is no longer a story that depends on a few grains of pollen. Its strongest evidence is spatial. Multiple Neanderthals, carefully positioned, concentrated in one feature of the cave. If that interpretation is correct, mortuary behavior did not begin as a unique achievement of Homo sapiens. Either Neanderthals developed it independently, inherited some capacity from an earlier common ancestor, or participated in traditions that moved between human populations. Yet the very age and complexity of Shanidar make absolute proof difficult. To understand what a secure Paleolithic burial looks like, researchers needed a grave whose sediments, joints, and decomposition history could all be reconstructed. That evidence emerged from a small child found in a Kenyan cave. Number 3. Mtoto at Pangayasaidi. The first signs were so fragile that they barely resembled bone. During excavation at Pangayasaidi, a cave near the coast of Kenya, archaeologists encountered a shallow circular feature containing badly decomposed human remains. Attempts to expose the skeleton in the field risked destroying it. The sediment was stabilized and removed as a block. In the laboratory, researchers excavated it grain by grain, using microscopy and three-dimensional imaging to follow bones that sometimes survived only as powdery traces. What appeared was the partial skeleton of a child approximately 2.5 to 3 years old. The child was later given the name Mototo, meaning child in Swahili. Dental anatomy was broadly consistent with Homo sapiens, although some features retained a more archaic form. That mosaic fits a wider pattern in Africa. Our species did not acquire every modern anatomical trait at the same moment. The individual buried at Pangayasaidi belonged to a population living during that long process. Mtoto lay on the right side with the knees drawn toward the chest. The body occupied a pit whose sediment differed from the surrounding cave floor. Geochemical measurements, grain size analysis, and micromorphology showed that the feature had been excavated and then filled with material gathered nearby. The bones supplied another test. In an exposed corpse, scavengers, gravity, water, and the collapse of soft tissue tend to scatter small bones and separate unstable joints. Mumtoto's skeleton retained close anatomical associations. Joints that normally disarticulate early had moved very little. That meant the body had decomposed where it was found, inside a confined space filled with earth. The skull added a final clue. Its collapse and rotation differed from the rest of the body. Researchers proposed that the head may originally have rested on a perishable support, perhaps a pillow-like bundle of plant material. The body may also have been wrapped. Neither object survives, so both ideas remain interpretations rather than confirmed grave goods. Luminescence dating of the surrounding deposits placed the burial at 78,300 years ago, with an uncertainty of about 4,100 years. It became the oldest securely documented Homo sapiens burial in Africa. That title requires careful wording. Older possible examples of body disposal exist, and African sites such as Border Cave and Taramsa have produced important early human remains. But preservation, excavation history, or uncertain context makes direct comparison difficult. Mount Toto's claim rests on the convergence of modern excavation, laboratory recovery, sediment analysis, and taphonomy. The rarity of older African graves may also be misleading. Tropical soils often destroy bone, and large parts of the continent remain archaeologically undersampled. An absence of preserved burials is not evidence that communities ignored their dead. It may reveal more about geology and research history than about ancient behavior. The significance lies not only in age. Mentoto shows how archaeology distinguishes intention from appearance. A skeleton in a cave is not automatically a burial. Researchers looked for a cut pit, contrasting fill, articulation, decomposition in place, and the movement expected when flesh disappeared. Each independent line of evidence pointed toward the same sequence. A fresh body was placed in a deliberately excavated hollow and covered soon afterward. What happened above the grave is missing. No ornament or animal offering was securely identified. There is no proof of a ceremony, spoken words, or belief about the child's destination. Yet someone protected the body from exposure and returned earth over it. The age of the child is difficult to ignore. Several early burials across Africa and the Levant involve infants, children, or adolescents. The sample is too small to establish a universal rule, and young bones may be preserved or discovered in biased ways. Still, the pattern raises a human question that science cannot quantify easily. Children also make the practical explanation less complete. A small body requires less effort to move and cover, but Mount Toto's grave involved more than efficiency. The posture was arranged, the pit was filled, and the head may have been supported. The treatment looks deliberate at every scale the researchers could test. Did the death of a child create a kind of loss that encouraged formal burial? Or were children selected because age carried a symbolic meaning now beyond recovery? Mount Toto provides no object that can answer. Its strength is the grave itself. The burial proves careful treatment, but it leaves the intended meaning almost completely open. An older child burial in the Levant changes that. The individual had survived a devastating injury for years. And when death came, something from an animal was placed directly across the body. Number 2. Qafzeh 11. Qafzeh Cave rises above the landscape near Nazareth. Its middle Paleolithic layers contain the remains of numerous early humans, several of whom appear to have been intentionally buried between roughly 90 and 100,000 years ago. The cave belonged to a landscape repeatedly occupied by human groups moving through the Levant. The stone tools around the burials were made with Middle Paleolithic Levallois methods, technology once too easily associated only with Neanderthals. At Qafzeh, people with largely modern human anatomy use the same broad technological tradition. One grave stands apart. Qafzeh was an adolescent, approximately 12 or 13 years old. The skeleton lay in a pit cut into the cave floor. The body had been placed on its back, with the legs flexed. Near the upper chest, close to the face and hands, archaeologists found deer antlers positioned in direct contact with the body. That arrangement was difficult to dismiss as accident. The antlers were not simply one fragment among scattered animal bones. Their position within the original space of the corpse suggests deliberate placement during burial. The hand position is especially important. As the soft tissues disappeared, small hand bones remained associated with the antlered object. That spatial relationship would be difficult to create through later sediment movement. The object entered the grave while the body still retained its original form. Then researchers examined the skull. Three-dimensional imaging revealed a severe injury that had occurred years before death. A blow had damaged the frontal region of the cranium and likely affected the brain. Bone healing showed that Qafzeh survived for a long period afterward, perhaps around 8 years. The precise effects cannot be reconstructed. The injury may have produced neurological, cognitive, or motor difficulties, but diagnosis from a fossil skull has limits. What is clear is that the adolescent lived long enough for extensive healing. In a mobile Paleolithic community, that survival may have required assistance. Assistance should not be romanticized. The adolescent may have retained substantial independence, and a healed injury does not tell us who provided food or protection. Even so, survival over several years places Qafzeh within a social network rather than outside it. This creates two connected stories. The first is about life. A child with a major cranial injury remained part of the group for years. The second is about death. The same individual received a deliberate burial with an object that appears to have been selected and positioned beside the body. Were the antlers a personal possession, a symbol of an animal, season, clan, or landscape? Were they placed to honor the adolescent, protect the grave, or accompany the dead? No surviving evidence chooses among those possibilities. But the placement matters because it crosses an archaeological threshold. A grave demonstrates care for a body. A deliberately positioned object suggests that the burial communicated something beyond containment. Qafzeh Cave strengthens that interpretation through repetition. Archaeologists identify several burials at the site, including adults and children. Bodies were often flexed, and ochre pieces occurred in the same broader occupation. Perforated marine shells, some bearing pigment, show that these people were already collecting and modifying objects with potential symbolic value, although the shells cannot all be linked directly to graves. One burial contained an adult and a young child together. Others occupied nearby levels of the cave. 7 interments have been proposed in total. The graves do not all look identical, but their concentration suggests the cave repeatedly became a place where the dead were treated differently from ordinary refuse. Ochre and shells widened the geography of those choices. The marine coast lay tens of kilometers away, while pigment sources also required movement across the landscape. Perforated shells could be carried on the body, exchanged, or displayed. Even when they were not grave goods, they show a capacity to make material objects stand for social information. The inhabitants were not behaviorally simple. They transported materials, used color, made ornaments, and treated at least some dead individuals in structured ways. This combination matters more than any single object. A deer antler alone could be accidental. A pit alone could be practical. But prepared graves, curated shells, pigments, and long-term care converge on a population whose social world extended beyond immediate survival. Still, caution is essential. The antlers do not prove belief in an afterlife. People place meaningful objects with the dead for many reasons, including remembrance by survivors. A funeral can be symbolic without resting on a formal religion. Qafzeh brings us as close as archaeology may come to observing meaning enter an early grave. A cared-for adolescent, a prepared pit, and an animal object placed against the body form a sequence that appears deeply intentional. But one exceptional burial could reflect one exceptional death. The discovery at number 1 shifts the scale. Instead of asking why a single child received special treatment, it asks whether communities across an entire region were already sharing rules for how the dead should be placed. Number 1. The Burials of Tinshemet Cave. Tinshemet Cave lies in central Israel, close to other sites that once formed a corridor between Africa and Eurasia. Excavations there uncovered stone tools, animal remains, abundant pieces of ochre, and human bones dating to the middle part of the Middle Paleolithic, broadly between 130,000 and 80,000 years ago. Among those remains were articulated skeletons. That phrase carries unusual weight in a cave. Human bones can enter deposits through collapse, scavenging, water, later disturbance, or repeated occupation. Articulation narrows those possibilities. When several fragile connections survive, the body was likely covered before natural processes could scatter it. At least 5 individuals are represented at the site. Their bodies were not dispersed randomly through the cave sediment. Some retained anatomical connections and occupied positions consistent with deliberate placement. Ochre and animal remains appeared within funerary contexts. On its own, Tinshemet would already be important, but the strongest discovery emerged only when researchers compared it with Qafzeh and Sungir, 2 other caves in the southern Levant. Across all 3 sites, bodies were often placed in strongly flexed positions. With a known exception at Qafzeh, the dead commonly lay on the right side. Objects such as animal remains and chunks of ochre occurred inside or alongside graves. The caves contained multiple burials rather than one isolated body. The consistency does not require a rigid ritual code. Individual postures and grave contents varied. What matters is the recurrence of a limited set of choices: flexing the body, selecting a side, using a cave feature, and placing material beside the dead. Patterns of that kind are the archaeological signature of learned behavior. This was not a repeated gesture in one family. It was a pattern across a region and across thousands of years. The ochre adds a material trail. At Middle Paleolithic sites in the Levant, people collected pigment, sometimes transported it from distant sources, and in some cases heated it to intensify or control its red color. Ochre also occurred outside burials, so it cannot be treated as exclusively funerary. But its repeated association with bodies places color inside a wider system of social communication. Stone tools reveal a parallel connection. Tinshemet, Qafzeh, Sungir, and nearby sites shared forms of centripetal Levallois technology. Similar ways of producing tools appeared beside similar patterns of hunting, pigment use, and treatment of the dead. The biological picture was less uniform. At Sungir and Qafzeh, even the classification of some fossils has been debated. Most are generally placed close to early Homo sapiens, but several traits fall outside the range expected in recent humans. Nearby Nesher Ramla produced remains with a different combination of archaic and Neanderthal-like features. The region was not occupied by a clean sequence in which one type of human simply replaced another. The Middle Paleolithic Levant was occupied at different times by early Homo sapiens, Neanderthals, and humans, with combinations of archaic features that do not fit comfortably into a simple label. The exact identity of every Tinshemet individual remains under study. Yet the archaeological behavior across the region appears more consistent than the anatomy. That creates the central mystery. If biologically diverse human populations used similar tools, pigments, and burial practices, how did those traditions spread? One possibility is convergence. Different groups facing the same social and environmental problems may have independently developed comparable behavior. Another is inheritance from older populations. A third is contact. Communities met, exchanged knowledge, and perhaps interbred as they moved through the Levantine corridor. Current evidence increasingly supports interaction among ancient human populations. Genes moved between lineages. Stoneworking knowledge crossed anatomical boundaries. Mortuary customs may have traveled as well. That final possibility cannot yet be tested with DNA from a burial custom. Cultural practices leave no genetic marker. Researchers infer transmission by comparing chronology, geography, technology, and repeated choices. The result is a strong hypothesis, not a recovered instruction passed from one group to another. Researchers have suggested that the concentration of bodies at Tinshemet could represent a place used specifically for funerary activity, perhaps approaching the idea of a cemetery. That description must be handled carefully. A modern cemetery is a formal institution with known social rules. Tinshemet offers no boundaries, markers, or written names. What it does offer is repeated return. People brought bodies into a cave, placed them in recognizable postures, used objects and pigment, and preserved the location in social memory. At Qafzeh and school, other communities did something strikingly similar. This is why Tinshemet stands at number 1. It does not contain the richest grave. It does not preserve the oldest claimed body disposal. It matters because it transforms burial from an isolated act into a shared cultural pattern near the beginning of the secure record. The search for the first belief, therefore, ends without a single inventor and without a precise day. By around 100,000 years ago, humans in the Levant were already treating some dead bodies according to repeated conventions. They chose positions. They returned to particular caves. They carried color and objects into the grave. And these actions may have been shared among populations that did not all look the same. Archaeology cannot tell us whether they believed in spirits, ancestors, rebirth, or another world. Those ideas leave no direct fossil, but a social boundary had been crossed. The dead were no longer only bodies exposed to decay. They had become participants in decisions made by the living. These graves do not line up from simple to advanced. Cremation is not more developed than burial. A grave filled with ivory is not more spiritual than a small pit containing a child, and the absence of grave goods does not mean the absence of grief. What changes is how much of the relationship between the living and the dead survives in the ground. Archaeology can identify a cut in the sediment, the position of a joint, the chemistry of a pigment, or wear on a bead. It can show that a body was placed, covered, revisited, or marked. Each result narrows the story. None recovers the thoughts of the people standing at the grave. That limit is not a failure. It is what keeps evidence separate from imagination. The pattern that remains is precise. People invested labor in bodies that could no longer repay them. They remembered locations after an individual had disappeared from daily life. They selected colors, animals, ornaments, postures, and architecture to manage a relationship changed by death. Perhaps belief did not begin as an explanation of another world. Perhaps it began with a problem in this one. Someone was gone, but still mattered. Covering a body can protect a camp. Returning to the place creates memory. Repeating the act turns memory into tradition. Objects and color give that tradition a visible form. Somewhere within that long process, meanings may have reached beyond what death made visible. No artifact marks the exact border. That is why the search for the first belief ends not with a date, but with a gradual change in the way the living refuse to let death erase a person completely. The first grave was not created when someone learned how to dig a hole. It appeared when the living decided that a dead person should remain part of the human world. We may never recover the words spoken at that moment. But beneath cave floors and ancient houses, the actions remain. And somewhere, an older trace may still be waiting.